Senator Lirak Vorn stood at the heart of the Alliance Senate chamber, a vast, vaulted expanse suspended in the perpetual twilight of the Nexus station. The chamber was a monument to order, concentric rings of tiered seating rising in polished obsidian tiers, each seat occupied by representatives of 1,000 species bound by the Covenant of Stars. Holographic constellations rotated lazily above the central dais, mapping the territories of an empire that had endured for 20 millennia. The air hummed with the faint, resonant pulse of translation fields, ensuring that every voice, no matter how alien its origin, could be heard in the listener's native tongue. Vorn had risen to prominence on a singular, unassailable truth: humanity was extinct. 10,000 years earlier, the species known as Homo sapiens had vanished from the galaxy. Their final transmissions, garbled cries from a collapsing stellar empire, had painted a picture of unrelenting catastrophe. Core worlds shattered under self-inflicted cataclysms, fleets lost to uncharted wormhole ruptures, billions dead in a cascade of hubris and entropy. The survivors, if any remained, had scattered into the void, their warp drives failing one by one, their colonies succumbing to isolation and collapse. Vorn had made this history his foundation. His speeches were meticulous dissections of the Terran extinction event, delivered with the precision of a pathologist presenting a completed autopsy. Humanity, he would declare, is not a species that can be preserved through sentiment. They burned too brightly and too briefly, leaving only the ash of their ambition. To speak of their return is to deny the finality of annihilation. His opponents, those who clung to fringe theories of hidden enclaves or dormant seed ships, were dismissed as romantics indulging in the ghost stories of a dead race. On this day, Vorn was scheduled to deliver the keynote address in favor of the Extinction Formalization Act, a legislative formality that would seal humanity's absence in the galactic record. No more exploratory missions to their ruined systems. No more subsidies for scholars chasing spectral data. The galaxy would move forward, unburdened by the myth of a species that refused to stay buried. As he prepared in the antechamber, surrounded by his staff of analytical aides, a murmur rippled through the outer corridors. Vorn ignored it at first. The Senate was a cauldron of petty intrigues, but the murmur grew into a wave, carrying with it the unmistakable edge of alarm. His chief protocol officer, a slender Velari named Kesh, burst through the doors, her chromatophores flushing a hectic orange. "Senator," she said, her voice fraying at the edges, "there is an anomaly, an intercepted transmission." Vorn turned from the holographic outline of his speech, irritation sharpening his gaze. "An anomaly in the comms relays is a matter for the gridmasters, not for me. What does this have to do with the day's proceedings?" Kesh extended a data shard, its surface crawling with encrypted glyphs. "It has everything to do with it. The transmission was received simultaneously across 3 primary relay nodes. It is a single message, formatted in an obsolete protocol, human protocol." The word hung in the air like a blade suspended above a fraying rope. Vorn took the shard and interfaced it with his personal terminal. The decryption was partial, layers of fractal ciphers that had lain dormant for 10,000 years, but the header resolved clearly enough. A terse declaration, appended with a designation that no one had seen in living memory. "Sol Command." Vorn stared at the words, their stark, angular script cutting through the haze of archival noise. Sol Command. The central military nexus of the Terran Commonwealth, a name invoked only in cautionary databanks. He forced a measured breath, suppressing the reflexive chill that accompanied the unexpected. "A forgery," he said flatly. "Some obsessive attempting to disrupt the vote." But Kesh was already querying secondary sources. Her eyes widened as additional reports flooded in. Not one transmission, but a cascade. Every major communication network in Alliance space, relay buoys, planetary datanets, even the deep space listening posts, was registering the same signature. Human encryption codes, buried under millennia of protocol obsolescence, were propagating like roots, forcing their way through cracked stone. The messages were identical, brief, unadorned bursts containing nothing more than that single identifier, and a sequence of navigational vectors. Vorn strode from the antechamber into the Senate proper, the chamber's ambient murmur falling silent as he approached the central dais. Hundreds of eyes, compound, multifaceted, or telescopic, fixed upon him. The presiding chair, a massive Korath named Thaler, rumbled with uncharacteristic hesitance. Senator Vorn, the galleries are in disarray, these signals. They are everywhere, untraceable origins, unbreakable encryption. Let me see the full scope, Vorn demanded. A holographic manifold sprang to life above the dais, depicting a storm of data points, green icons marking the receipt of the transmissions, clustered in a pattern that defied conventional jamming or spoofing. The volume was staggering, thousands of simultaneous bursts, saturating every frequency allocated to civilian and military traffic alike. His political adversaries were quick to seize the moment. From the opposition tier, Delegate Myron of the Salari Concord, a species renowned for its relentless archival instincts, rose to her considerable height, her voice carrying the chime of struck crystal. This is no mere forgery, Senator. The encryption matches forensic reconstructions of Terran military ciphers, down to the quantum irregularities in their key derivation. Whatever this is, it speaks in a voice the galaxy has not heard in 10,000 years. Vorn's mind raced through the possibilities. A dedicated simulation, perhaps, an automated archive gone rogue, programmed to mimic the cadence of a lost era, or a deliberate provocation by some faction seeking to upend the status quo. But the sheer scale of the intrusion gnawed at him. No single actor, no matter how resourceful, could flood the Alliance's communication lattice with such precision without leaving a trace. He stepped onto the dais, his voice cutting through the rising tide of debate. Even if these signals are genuine artifacts of human technology, they prove nothing beyond the persistence of their machines. Empty vessels, broadcasting from forgotten vaults. Humanity itself is gone, dust scattered across 1,000 barren worlds. This is not resurrection, it is an echo. The chamber absorbed his words, but the doubt lingered, visible in the subtle shifts of posture and the flickering of bioluminescent displays. Vorn pressed on, outlining the safeguards that had been in place for millennia, exhaustive surveys of human space, every habitable system stripped bare, every signal trace mapped and extinguished. The extinction event had been total, irrevocable, yet as the debate dragged into its second hour, a new report arrived, relayed through the chamber's secure nexus. Sensors at the periphery of Alliance space, automated pickets stationed along the ragged frontier of former Terran territory, had detected anomalous gravitic distortions, subtle perturbations in spacetime, consistent with the mass displacement of vessels executing coordinated slip translations. Vorn felt the first fracture in his certainty, a hairline crack beneath the surface of his convictions. He had built his career on the finality of humanity's erasure, on the belief that some endings were absolute, written into the fabric of history with the weight of suns. But now, across the breadth of an empire that spanned 5,000 light years, the dead were speaking, and they were speaking with a clarity that no echo could achieve. As the chamber descended into a chaos of demands and counterclaims, Vorn retreated to a private alcove, calling up the raw data from the peripheral sensors. The distortions were faint but unmistakable, a distributed wavefront, originating from coordinates deep within the quarantined exclusion zone known as the Shattered Veil. Hundreds of individual signatures, masked by gravitational lensing and fractal dispersal patterns, techniques that the Alliance's own fleets had only begun to master. He stared at the projections, the cold geometry of the readings refusing to resolve into comforting falsehoods. For the first time in decades, Senator Lirak Vorn, a man who had spent his life proving that humanity could not return, wondered if there were forces in the universe that did not bend to proof. In the silence of the alcove, with the clamor of the Senate muffled behind armored bulkheads, he found himself tracing the faint, looping script of the transmission header. Sol Command, 4 syllables that had once defined the frontier of a species' reach. And in that moment, a quiet, unbidden thought pierced the edifice of his certainty. What if the dead had simply been waiting? Senator Lirak Vorn watched the data streams multiply like fissures propagating through brittle stone. The transmissions had not ceased, they had intensified. Every relay node in the Alliance's sprawling communication lattice, 3 million strong, spanning the void from the crystalline heart of the Salari, conquered to the storm-racked fringes of the Korath expanse, was now saturated with the same relentless pulse. Sol command, the identifier repeated without variation, stripped of preamble or explanation, as if the sender presumed its authority required no further qualification. Vorn stood in the Senate's auxiliary command vault, a fortified chamber buried beneath the main assembly hall. Around him, a cohort of gridmaster technicians, specialists whose lives were spent untangling the snarls of interstellar data flow, worked in grim silence. Their instruments painted a picture of systematic violation. The human encryption was not merely impenetrable, it was adaptive, reshaping itself in response to every probe and countermeasure. Attempts to isolate and silence the signals resulted in their propagation through secondary channels, exploiting dormant protocols that had lain unused since the last verified human transmissions 10,000 years prior. They are not broadcasting blindly. One of the gridmasters, a diminutive Shalari named Tur with a lattice of fiber optic tendrils pulsing beneath translucent skin, reported. The pattern is deliberate. Each packet is keyed to a specific node, routed through vectors that bypass our primary firewalls. It is as if they possess a complete map of our network architecture. Vorn's mandibles clicked softly in agitation. Impossible. The Alliance's communication protocols have been revised 7 times since the extinction event. No external entity could possess such knowledge. Unless they were never fully disconnected, Tur replied, her tendrils flickering with the subtle hues of analytical focus. Or unless they have been listening, silently, continuously for all these years. The notion settled over Vorn like frost on a hull plate. He had always dismissed the possibility of hidden human survivors as the desperate clinging of myth makers. Yet the precision of these intrusions suggested something more than automated relics. This was the work of a living intelligence, one that had retained its grasp on the galaxy's connective tissue long after its supposed annihilation. Delegate Myron entered the vault without preamble, her elongated silhouette casting a shadow across the holographic displays. Her voice carried the unyielding clarity of a species that measured truth by the weight of accumulated records. The opposition has called for an emergency session. The transmissions are being received by civilian networks now, every planetary governor, every merchant consortium, every frontier outpost. Public channels are flooding with demands for explanation. The question of authenticity is no longer theoretical. Vorn turned from the displays, forcing his thoughts into alignment. Authenticity proves nothing. Even if these signals originate from active human systems, it does not compel the conclusion of their survival. Automated war machines, perhaps, left to execute a final, pre-programmed maneuver. Myron's multifaceted eyes narrowed, and the sensor perturbations along the shattered veil. 300 distinct gravitic signatures, distributed across a volume of 20 cubic light-years. That is no single derelict activating a long-dormant beacon. Before Vorn could formulate a response, the primary display flared with an urgent alert. A senior gridmaster stepped forward, her voice stripped of inflection. Multiple contacts, long-range sensor buoys in Grid Sector 9 have registered coordinated slipspace ruptures. The distortions are resolving into discrete objects. The chamber filled with the low thrum of converging data. The holographic manifold expanded, revealing a wavefront of emergent signatures. Ships, hundreds of them, materializing from the cloaking haze of folded spacetime. They emerged not in a single, vulnerable cluster, but in a dispersed formation that defied tactical orthodoxy, each vessel separated by precisely calculated intervals, their slip translations overlapping to create a continuous front that masked individual entry points. Vorn stared at the display, the scale of the phenomenon eroding the foundations of his skepticism. The fleet was not charging forward in reckless abandon. It was advancing with the inexorable patience of a tide reclaiming a shoreline. Sensor returns painted a picture of vessels both familiar and alien, the blunt, predatory profiles of ancient Terran designs, interspersed with hulls that bore no resemblance to any known human archetype. Some were massive, their silhouettes swollen with the mass of generation ships. Others were lean and predatory, optimized for interdiction and deep penetration. They are not hiding, Tur observed quietly. They are announcing themselves. The first direct message arrived without ceremony, punching through the encrypted murk with the clarity of a blade parting silk. It was not a declaration of intent, nor a demand for parley. It was a simple status report, formatted as if addressing a subordinate command. Sol command actual to all receiving networks. Primary dispersal phase complete. Fleet coherence at 98%. Transit to nominal insertion points commencing. Standby for handshake protocols. The words hung in the vault, devoid of bombast or threat, carrying instead the matter-of-fact assurance of a routine operation proceeding on schedule. Vorn felt a hollowness beneath his primary ribs, a sensation he had encountered only once before, during a near-catastrophic diplomatic crisis 3 decades prior. It was the visceral recognition that the rules of engagement, indeed, the very frame of reference, had shifted irrevocably. Myron voiced what others were beginning to articulate in fragmented bursts. They are coming here, not as refugees pleading for sanctuary, not as scavengers emerging from hiding. They are returning. Vorn's response was automatic, a reflex born of years spent fortifying the concept of human irrelevance. Returning implies a place to which one belongs. Humanity forfeited any claim to this galaxy when their empire collapsed. Whatever these ships represent, survivors, successors, or self-replicating automata, they arrive as interlopers. But the words rang hollow even to his own hearing. The fleet was not pausing at the periphery to negotiate terms of entry. Sensor logs confirmed it. The vessels were accelerating toward the interior of Alliance space, their trajectories converging on navigational beacons that had been established millennia after humanity's presumed demise. They moved with the confidence of entities that did not require invitation. As the vault emptied, its occupants dispersing to relay the mounting crisis to their respective governments, Vorn remained before the primary display. The fleet's formation was visible now in tactical overlays, a distributed array, each element maintaining precise separation yet functioning as a cohesive whole. It was a maneuver that required flawless synchronization across impossible distances, achieved without the benefit of the Alliance's vaunted synchro pulse networks. He reached out and summoned a single transmission packet, isolating it from the flood. The encryption yielded nothing, no metadata, no provenance markers. Only the signature remained, Sol Command, 4 syllables, freighted with the presumption of unbroken continuity. Vorn had spent his career asserting that humanity's disappearance was a terminal event, a collapse from which no revival was possible. He had lectured on the fragility of species that expanded beyond their means, on the inevitability of entropy claiming even the most ambitious civilizations. Yet here, arrayed across the strategic displays, was a presence that mocked such certainties, not through overwhelming force, but through the simple, unrelenting fact of its persistence. He recalled a fragment from an ancient human text, preserved in the Senate archives among the detritus of their cultural output. You may bury a man alive, but you cannot bury his shadow. The fleet advancing through the outer darkness was no shadow. It was a reclamation. And as the first of the human vessels crossed the quarantine perimeter of the shattered veil, without challenge, without hesitation, Senator Vorn realized that the question was no longer whether humanity had survived. The only remaining uncertainty was what form their return would take. In the silence of the vault, with the weight of an uninvited homecoming bearing down upon them, one of the junior gridmasters murmured a question that would echo through the coming hours. If they never truly left, what exactly have we been guarding against? Here is the third part of the story. Part 3. The measure of absence. The Senate chamber had become a crucible. The once orderly tiers of seats were now a riot of agitation, delegates surging to their feet, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of translated outrage, fear, and disbelief. Holographic projections of the advancing fleet dominated the central dais, its thousands of discrete signatures pulsing with methodical precision as they cut through the outer reaches of Alliance space. No attempt at interception had been made. No blockade had been formed. The simple truth was that no commander could formulate a response to an adversary that refused to declare itself an adversary. Senator Lirak Vorn stood at the edge of the storm, his position as the foremost proponent of humanity's extinction, now a precarious perch atop shifting foundations. He had entered this chamber intending to enshrine the finality of a species' erasure. Now he found himself defending the very concept of erasure against the inexorable advance of its contradiction. His opponents, sensing the fracture in his authority, pressed their advantage relentlessly. "They are not hiding," Delegate Myron reiterated, her voice carrying over the tumult like the tolling of a resonant bell. "They are not fleeing. They move as if every parsec of this galaxy is theirs to traverse without hindrance or apology. Whatever else they may be, they are not the shattered remnants of a dying race." Vorn forced his response through the constriction of his secondary throat. Intent is not proven by motion alone. A fleet does not imply a civilization. They could be a rogue armada, severed from any central authority, executing a contingency program without oversight or restraint. The rebuttal faltered against the mounting evidence. The transmissions continued unabated, their content expanding incrementally but never deviating from a pattern of clinical functionality. Fleet status reports, logistical synchronization commands. Quantum key exchanges distributed across multiple bands. There were no pleas for recognition, no broadcasts of desperation or vindication. Only the steady, relentless accumulation of data that suggested a command structure fully intact and entirely self-sufficient. In a private conference chamber adjacent to the Senate floor, Vorn convened a crisis council composed of the most senior gridmasters, fleet tacticians, and analytical adjuncts. The room's walls were clad in null field dampeners, ensuring absolute isolation from external surveillance. At its center, a strategic hololith rendered the human formation in exhaustive detail. Over 4,000 vessels, ranging from kilometer-long behemoths to the dagger-thin silhouettes of fast couriers. Their deployment was not the haphazard clustering of desperate survivors, but a calculated dispersal, each ship maintaining optimal separation to deny any single weapon platform a meaningful target while preserving instantaneous mutual support. They are employing fractal dispersal, Admiral Krenthaler of the Alliance Perimeter Command explained, his massive frame hunched over the display. The Korath's voice was a seismic rumble, tempered by the gravity of his assessment. Every element of the fleet is positioned to reinforce any other within microseconds. It is a formation that sacrifices offensive concentration for absolute survivability. No known military doctrine employs it because it presumes a force too large to be destroyed in detail. Vorn studied the projection, searching for the telltale markers of decay, mismatched trajectories, failing power signatures, the subtle asymmetries of a fleet held together by expedience rather than cohesion. There were none. The vessels moved as if bound by an unseen discipline, their slipspace transits executed with a precision that bordered on the preternatural. "How is this possible?" he asked, the question slipping past the barriers of his composure. 10,000 years of isolation, of presumed fragmentation and collapse. Even if isolated enclaves survived, how do they maintain this level of synchronization? One of the gridmasters, the Shylari Tur, extended a cluster of optic filaments into the data stream. "They have not been isolated in the manner we assumed. Buried within the transmissions are navigational ephemerides, comprehensive maps of every relay node, wormhole, and stellar drift vector in Alliance space. These maps are current to within the last decade. They have been observing us, charting our movements. They know exactly where every listening post, every patrol route, every sensor blind spot resides. The revelation settled over the chamber like the onset of vacuum. Vorn felt the weight of a gaze turned inward upon them, patient and unblinking, spanning the gulf of centuries. Humanity had not merely endured, it had watched, it had waited. The internal conflict that had begun as a hairline fracture now widened into a chasm. Vorn had built his career on the certainty that humanity's disappearance was absolute, a natural consequence of overreach and entropy. To accept the reality of this fleet was to admit that survival on such a scale required more than chance or superior technology. It demanded a form of endurance that defied the predictable decay of all other known civilizations, a refusal to yield, sustained across millennia of isolation. As the Council deliberated containment strategies, diplomatic overtures, defensive deployments, information suppression, a new transmission arrived, this one addressed explicitly to the Alliance Coordinating Authority. It was a formal declaration, concise and devoid of preamble, to the designated custodians of claimed stellar volume. Sol Command asserts continuity of operational mandate within territories designated as the Sol Protectorate, comprising all systems within a 60 light-year radius of the primary Sol stellar referent, as well as all associated colonial volumes. No cessation of legal or operational authority has been enacted. Current transit vectors are executing return to home systems and resumption of standard operational posture. Request is made for the prompt cessation of all non-human activities within the aforementioned volume, including survey, salvage, and occupation. Handshake protocols for jurisdictional clarification will be provided upon arrival at designated insertion points. End transmission. The words required no elaboration. They were not a request for negotiation. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of an owner reclaiming a house that had been occupied in his absence. Silence gripped the council chamber. Admiral Thaller's massive fists clenched, the plates of his carapace grinding audibly. They claim ownership. After 10,000 years of absence, they claim ownership. They claim continuity, Tur corrected softly, as if no appreciable interval has passed, as if the extinction event never occurred. Vorn stared at the text, its implications unraveling the carefully constructed architecture of his worldview. He had spent decades arguing that humanity's disappearance marked the end of its relevance, that no species could vanish so completely and retain any meaningful claim to its former expanse. But this message asserted the opposite, that true continuity was not measured by unbroken presence, but by unbroken will. In the quiet aftermath, as the Council grappled with the audacity of a claim that acknowledged no statute of abandonment, Vorn found himself alone before a viewport overlooking the ceaseless rotation of Nexus Station's primary docks. Beyond the armored glass, the stars burned with their ancient indifference, marking no distinction between the living and the lost. He had always believed that extinction was a verdict without appeal. But as the fleet continued its approach, methodical, unperturbed, and utterly without concession, he began to understand that there were forces which refused to accept verdicts, even those rendered by time itself. And in the face of such refusal, the only question that remained was not whether humanity had been erased, but whether anything in the universe possessed the power to enforce an erasure that was not freely surrendered. Here is the fourth part of the story. Part 4, The Weight of Empty Thrones. The formal declaration from Sol Command spread through the Alliance like a shockwave, propagating through a brittle lattice. Every planetary governor, every sector command, every civilian data conduit reverberated with the same uncompromising message. Humanity did not request re-entry into the galaxy they had once dominated. They asserted ownership of it, as if the intervening millennia were merely a period of temporary absence, a pause in the routine of administration rather than a collapse into oblivion. Senator Lirak Vorn stood at the center of a fractured emergency convocation, the chamber's vast tiers now divided into agitated factions. The declaration had polarized the alliance overnight. Some delegates advocated immediate diplomatic overtures, treating the approaching fleet as a rediscovered diaspora worthy of negotiation and alliance. Others called for mobilization of the combined defense perimeter, viewing the claim of unceded sovereignty as an act of territorial aggression. Vorn, whose lifelong advocacy of human irrelevance had positioned him as the definitive authority on the matter, found himself caught in the widening rift between these positions, his certainty eroding with every new transmission. In a secure annex beneath the Senate floor, Vorn met with a small cadre of advisors and senior military analysts. The hololith dominating the chamber displayed the fleet's inexorable advance, 4,000 vessels, their formation maintaining flawless coherence as they traversed the exclusion zones once designated as human tomb worlds. Detailed sensor returns revealed further impossibilities. The ships showed no signs of the decay that should have accumulated over 10,000 years. Power plants operated at peak efficiency. Hulls bore no pitting from micrometeoroid impacts or the ravages of unmaintained slipspace transit. Structural frameworks exhibited none of the microfractures that plagued even the most meticulously preserved Alliance vessels after mere centuries in deep storage. "They have not merely survived," Admiral Thaler rumbled, his voice heavy with the implications of the data. "They have maintained themselves, entirely." As if every system, every component has been under active stewardship without interruption. The Shilari gridmaster, interfaced directly with the sensor feeds, her optic filaments trembling with the volume of information. There is evidence of continuous operation. Logistical manifests embedded in the transmissions reference supply chains, maintenance rotations, and personnel transfers. These are not relics awakened from cryogenic suspension. They are an active civilization. Vorn's mandibles tightened, the physical manifestation of an internal fracture that had deepened with each revelation. He had constructed his intellectual edifice on the premise that human extinction was inevitable, a mathematical certainty born of their documented excesses, overextended supply lines, demographic collapse, the self-inflicted ruin of their primary worlds. Survival on this scale demanded more than endurance. It required a level of discipline, of unrelenting focus, that bordered on the incomprehensible. How did a species rebuild in isolation, sustain thousands of capital ships, and emerge not as a ragged refugee fleet, but as a self-contained empire? The answer began to emerge in fragments of intercepted data. Secondary transmissions, coordinated bursts between the fleet elements, revealed a distributed network of habitation. Not a single vulnerable arc drifting in the void, but hundreds of mobile industrial complexes, asteroid refineries, orbital forges, and self-sustaining habitats propelled by cycler orbits and continuous slipspace microjumps. They had not hidden in a solitary refuge, waiting for rescue. They had built a new civilization in the interstices of the galaxy, concealed within the blind spots of stellar navigation, in the turbulent wakes of nebulae and the shadowed troughs of gravitational interference. "They turned absence into advantage," said, her voice a whisper of filaments brushing against data streams. "Where we saw emptiness, they found concealment. Where we recorded extinction, they forged independence." The implications struck Vorn with the force of a structural failure. Humanity had not clung to survival through desperation or luck. They had chosen withdrawal, transforming the very collapse that the Alliance had declared terminal into a deliberate reconfiguration. The extinction event was not their defeat, but their departure, a strategic retreat into the unclaimed dark, where no external power could dictate their terms of existence. This understanding ignited a deeper conflict within him. For years, he had viewed humanity's disappearance as proof of their inherent fragility, a cautionary parable for all species that overreached their grasp. But the evidence now suggested something far more unnerving, that humanity possessed the capacity to endure precisely because they refused to measure their survival by the standards of visibility or centrality. They did not need to hold their former worlds, command their former networks, or broadcast their continued existence to remain a coherent force. They simply persisted, unseen and unchallenged, until the moment was theirs to reclaim. As the Council debated responses, ranging from the deployment of interdiction fleets to the transmission of a unified diplomatic package, a new development rendered further argument moot. The forward elements of the human fleet reached the outer boundary of the Sol Protectorate, a ragged sphere of systems long since declared lifeless, their planet scoured by automated probes and left to the silence of abandonment. Rather than halting to negotiate, the fleet divided into precise task formations. Hundreds of vessels peeled away from the main body, accelerating toward individual systems with the efficiency of a returning administration resuming its rounds. Live sensor feeds confirmed the scale of their intent. Shipboard factories began deploying prefabricated infrastructure, orbital habitats, automated mining arrays, and communication buoys, all constructed from onboard resources and maneuvered into position with a rapidity that outpaced even the most advanced Alliance construction platforms. They were not merely approaching their former territory. They were occupying it, systematically reasserting control over space that had been empty for 10,000 years. Delegate Myron entered the annex, her crystalline form refracting the hololith's light into a fractured prism. They are not asking for our leave. They are proceeding as if our presence in those systems is the temporary intrusion. Vorn turned from the display, where a dozen human vessels were already establishing dominance over the approach vectors to the Sol system itself. Then we must make them acknowledge the reality that has prevailed in their absence. 10,000 years is not a vacancy that can be filled by declaration. But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at their foundation. The fleet's actions demonstrated a fundamental asymmetry. The Alliance had spent those millennia expanding into the vacuum left by humanity's withdrawal, treating their former domains as a resource to be partitioned and administered. Humanity, however, had never vacated those domains in any absolute sense. They had simply removed themselves from contestation, preserving their claim in abeyance, enforced not by fleets or fortresses, but by the sheer fact of their continued existence. In the shadowed annex, with the hololith depicting the methodical reoccupation of a galaxy-spanning domain, Vorn confronted the full measure of his miscalculation. He had believed that absence equated to forfeiture, that time without presence was time without consequence. But humanity had demonstrated otherwise. They had held their sovereignty not through the clamor of continuous assertion, but through the quiet, unbroken thread of their survival. And now, as their ships moved to reclaim what they had never formally relinquished, the Alliance faced a truth that no amount of diplomatic precedent could contain. There were some possessions that could not be stripped away by the passage of years, because their owners had refused to release their grasp. In the silence that followed the first deployment of human orbital infrastructure, Admiral Thaler voiced the question that now haunted every strategist in the chamber. If they have waited this long to return, what exactly were they waiting for? The reoccupation of the Sol Protectorate proceeded with the inexorable rhythm of a process long anticipated rather than a campaign hastily improvised. Human vessels did not swarm their former systems in a frenzy of reclamation. They advanced with the measured deliberation of custodians returning to an estate held in escrow. Orbital platforms were unfurled from cavernous deployment bays, their skeletal frames blooming into functional habitats within hours. Automated tenders burrowed into asteroid belts, igniting fusion forges to extract volatiles and metals, transforming the bones of dead rock into the raw material of resurgence. Sensor buoys, slaved to a common navigational mesh, seeded the outer system volumes, knitting together a web of surveillance and control that spanned light minutes with the seamlessness of a single organism. Senator Lirak Vorn watched these operations unfold from the command vault of Nexus Station, where a continuous feed of high-resolution sensor data painted an image of methodical inevitability. Every action was economical, devoid of waste or ostentation. There were no triumphal broadcasts, no declarations of conquest. The fleet simply executed the tasks of restoration as if resuming an interrupted schedule. The restraint was what gnawed at Vorn most acutely. He had expected, had braced for a return marked by desperation or belligerence, ragged survivors staking desperate claim to their lost heritage, or vengeful successors demanding restitution for millennia of presumed usurpation. Instead, the humans behaved as if their departure had been a scheduled withdrawal, their absence a period of deliberate conservation rather than annihilation. This composure forced Vorn to confront the deepening fracture in his own convictions. He had long maintained that humanity's disappearance proved their essential unsustainability, that no species could endure the collapse of its primary infrastructure without succumbing to fragmentation and dissolution. Yet here they were, reasserting dominion over volumes of space that had lain fallow for 10,000 years, without apparent strain or improvisation. In a tense conclave with Alliance military and diplomatic principles, Vorn voiced the question that had begun to erode the foundations of his certainty. What manner of civilization endures in secret for millennia, maintaining thousands of warships and industrial platforms, only to emerge without demand or threat? What sustains such a prolonged withdrawal? Admiral Thaler, his craggy features etched with uncharacteristic uncertainty, gestured to the hololith, where a secondary wave of human support elements, previously undetected convoys of mobile yards and replenishment trains, emerged from concealed slipspace corridors. They have not endured by clinging to the periphery. The data suggests they reconfigured entirely. Entire populations relocated to distributed bastions, mobile habitats concealed within stellar phenomena that render them invisible to standard detection, gas giant magnetospheres, rogue planet swarms, the turbulent cores of nebular filaments. They did not hide to survive. They restructured to persist independently. Tur, the Shilari gridmaster, extended her filaments into a fragmented transmission intercepted from the fleet's internal network. Their doctrine is explicit in the ancillary data. They call it the Long Watch, a contingency framework predicated on the assumption of total territorial loss, not defeat but strategic disengagement, preserve core competencies, population, industry, command integrity, and maintain the capacity for reconstitution. They did not scatter to survive. They consolidated to remain whole. The revelation struck Vorn like the slow compression of a collapsing hull. Humanity had not merely survived the extinction event, they had anticipated it. Rather than fracture into isolated remnants, they had executed a controlled evacuation of their exposed centers, relocating their essential population and infrastructure to a constellation of hardened, self-sufficient redoubts. For 10,000 years, they had sustained themselves without reliance on external systems, without trade, without alliances, without the galactic commons that every other species deemed indispensable. They had turned isolation into self-reliance, transforming the very conditions of their supposed extinction into the foundation of their enduring sovereignty. This understanding ignited a profound internal conflict within Vorn. He had built his career on the premise that survival required continuity of presence. That absence inevitably equated to forfeiture, but humanity had demonstrated that presence could be deferred without being surrendered. They had held their claim not through the visible assertion of power, but through the invisible persistence of their essential will. Their return was not a resurrection from oblivion. It was the culmination of a strategy that had never conceded the possibility of permanent defeat. As the human fleet continued its reoccupation, deploying sensor lattices that overlapped and superseded Alliance picket deployments, the Alliance's responses faltered in the face of this implacable competence. Diplomatic transmissions were acknowledged and filed without reply. Probes launched to intercept and shadow human operations were shadowed in turn by counter-deployed platforms, their movements anticipated and neutralized without escalation. The humans neither invited confrontation nor avoided it. They simply proceeded, as if the space they were reclaiming had never truly left their possession. In the shadowed recesses of the command vault, Vorn found himself studying a single, unencrypted fragment intercepted from a human command circuit, a terse exchange between two vessels coordinating the emplacement of a perimeter control station. The dialogue was stripped of formality, suffused with the casual assurance of veterans resuming familiar duties. Sol Command, this is Bastion 3-1, primary arrays synchronized, perimeter secure. Copy Bastion 3-1, standby for relief rotation, it's good to be home. The words carried no triumphalism, no vindication, only the quiet certainty of return. Vorn replayed the exchange, searching for the tremor of desperation or the strain of improvisation that should have accompanied such an undertaking after millennia of exile. There was none. The speakers addressed the reclamation of their systems as an administrative resumption, not a miraculous recovery. This was the core of humanity's defiance. They had refused to allow their definition of self to be dictated by the perceptions of others. The galaxy had declared them extinct because they had withdrawn from the stage of observable events, but withdrawal was not surrender. They had preserved their identity, genetic, cultural, operational, in the unclaimed voids, waiting not for permission to exist, but for the moment when their presence could no longer be ignored. As the first human habitats achieved full orbital stability within the Sol system, massive, self-sustaining cylinders spinning up to generate a full gravity for their inhabitants, Vorn confronted the full scope of his misapprehension. He had believed that extinction was a state imposed by circumstance, an irreversible verdict delivered by the accumulation of loss. But humanity had demonstrated that a species could refuse such a verdict, maintaining the integrity of its purpose across gulfs of time and isolation that would have shattered any other known civilization. In the vault's dim illumination, with the hololith depicting the inexorable spread of human infrastructure across their former domains, Delegate Myron posed a question that cut to the heart of the unfolding crisis. If they have sustained themselves without us for 10,000 years, what precisely do they require from the rest of the galaxy now? Vorn had no answer. But as he watched the steady accretion of human presence, each deployment a quiet assertion of unbroken continuity, he began to understand that the question itself was the point. They required nothing. They had already proven they needed no one. And in that self-sufficiency lay a power greater than any fleet or fortress, the power to return without asking. The Alliance teetered on the edge of paralysis. Every attempted response to the human advance, whether diplomatic entreaty, military posturing, or analytical dissection, found itself reflected back, diminished and unanswered. Transmissions demanding clarification of intent were received and acknowledged by automated protocols, then set aside without substantive reply. Reconnaissance probes dispatched toward the reoccupying fleet were permitted to approach, only to be enveloped by overlapping sensor fields and escort drones that shadowed their every maneuver without interference or expulsion. The humans did not block observation. They simply continued their work, allowing the Alliance to witness the full scope of their reclamation. Senator Lirak Vorn stood in the heart of the Senate's strategic sanctum, a chamber now transformed into a relentless observatory of the unfolding return. The central hololith displayed not merely the advancing fleet, but the emergent architecture of a civilization reconstituting itself. Vast cycler habitats, each housing populations numbering in the millions, had maneuvered into stable orbits around their former colony worlds. Self-replicating industrial swarms stripped the carbonaceous cores of Kuiper belts, converting raw matter into fusion cores, structural lattices, and atmospheric seeding arrays. Within weeks of their arrival, the first planetary-scale engineering projects had begun, orbital mirrors repositioned to melt polar caps and liberate volatiles long locked in cryogenic stasis. The scale and efficiency of these operations defied every paradigm Vorn had employed to define human extinction. He had argued for decades that no species could survive the total loss of its primary infrastructure without irretrievable fragmentation. Yet the humans had not merely endured such loss, they had transcended it. Their society was not a desperate remnant clinging to the wreckage of former glory, but a distributed network of fully autonomous bastions, each capable of independent survival and mutual reinforcement. The fleet represented not their last reserves, but merely the vanguard of a far greater constellation. This realization forced Vorn to confront the deepest fracture in his worldview. In the privacy of his quarters, away from the ceaseless clamor of debate, he pored over intercepted fragments of human internal communications. What emerged was not the voice of a desperate diaspora, but the steady rhythm of a culture that had internalized isolation as a foundational principle. Logistical directives referenced watch protocols and contingency sustainment cycles, operational routines calibrated for indefinite self-reliance. Personnel exchanges between vessels and habitats proceeded with the mundane efficiency of scheduled rotations, devoid of the awe or hysteria that would accompany the reemergence of any other supposedly extinct species. One transmission in particular lodged itself in Vorn's thoughts, a brief exchange between a habitat command officer and a returning task force captain. The officer's voice carried no tremor of disbelief or vindication. Bastion Epsilon receiving task force Harrow. Docking protocols active. It's been 612 years since your last scheduled return. Welcome home. 612 years. The interval was stated as a simple datum, a routine gap between visits, not the span of a generational odyssey. The captain's response was equally unadorned. Good to be back. Status report. The exchange revealed the essence of human endurance. They had not merely survived in isolation, they had normalized it. 10,000 years of withdrawal had not been a period of desperate clinging, but a sustained operational state. They had built a civilization where separation from the galactic commons was not a calamity, but a deliberate and survivable condition. This capacity for self-imposed exile without dissolution forced Vorn to question the very framework through which he had understood survival. Every other species in the Alliance, himself included, defined continuity through unbroken connection, networks of trade, communication, and mutual dependence that wove disparate systems into a cohesive whole. Remove those connections, and disintegration inevitably followed, but humanity had severed those ties entirely and remained intact. They had preserved their unity not through the visible threads of interdependence, but through an internal discipline that required no external validation. The internal conflict that had shadowed Vorn since the first transmissions now crystallized into a stark recognition. He had spent his career asserting that humanity's disappearance proved their fragility, that true survival demanded persistent presence, lest oblivion claim what was unseen. But the humans had demonstrated the opposite. That presence could be withheld without forfeiting existence, that a species could withdraw into the unseen and emerge whole, its identity uncompromised by the passage of time or the indifference of observers. This truth manifested most clearly in the Alliance's own response, or lack thereof. Military mobilization had been proposed repeatedly, only to falter against the absence of provocation. The humans issued no ultimatums, made no territorial demands beyond their stated domains, and refrained from any action that could be construed as expansionist. They occupied only the systems they claimed as their own, systems that had lain empty for millennia, patrolled by automated beacons and stripped of any meaningful Alliance presence. To intercede would be to initiate conflict over spaces that humanity had never formally relinquished, and over which the Alliance held no defensible claim. In a rare moment of silence within the sanctum, Delegate Myron approached Vorn, her crystalline facets refracting the hololith's pale light. "They have given us a mirror," she said. "We have spent 10,000 years administering the vacuum of their absence, treating it as an inheritance to be partitioned and developed. Now they return and we discover that the vacuum was never truly empty, it was merely unoccupied. Vorn regarded the display, where a newly erected human sensor lattice, a mesh of distributed nodes spanning an entire system, rendered every Alliance probe within its volume transparent and redundant. "We presumed that abandonment equated to forfeiture," he replied. "That time without possession constituted transfer of ownership, but they never abandoned what they held. They simply chose not to defend it in our presence." Myron's voice chimed with quiet precision, "and in that choice lies their strength. They have demonstrated that sovereignty does not require continuous assertion. It requires only the capacity to reassert it when desired. We have no mechanism for erasing a claim that was never withdrawn." As the reoccupation progressed, planetary atmospheres seeded, habitats spun to full capacity, industrial output climbing to levels that rivaled the Alliance's most productive sectors, Vorn began to perceive the deeper structure of human persistence. They had not waited in impotent exile, nursing grudges against an indifferent galaxy. They had used their withdrawal to redefine the terms of their survival, building a foundation impervious to the disruptions that had shattered their original empire. Their return was not an act of desperation, but the deliberate conclusion of a strategy predicated on the certainty that they would eventually choose to reemerge. In the face of this unrelenting competence, Vorn understood that the Alliance confronted not merely a rival power, but an entirely different conception of existence, one in which disappearance was not synonymous with defeat. Humanity had proven that a species could vanish from the stage of observable events and yet retain the full measure of its will, waiting not for the galaxy's permission, but for the moment when their presence could no longer be denied. And as the first human habitats began transmitting open beacons, simple, unadorned signals declaring the restoration of Sol Protectorate space, Vorn realized the true scope of what had returned. It was not a fleet, nor a remnant, nor even a successor state. It was the same civilization that had dominated the galaxy 10,000 years before, unbroken and entire, having carried its essence intact through the intervening void. What remained was for the Alliance to decide whether it would acknowledge a sovereignty that had never truly been surrendered, or attempt, against all evidence, to impose an extinction that the humans themselves had refused to accept. Senator Lirak Vorn had spent a lifetime constructing arguments that humanity's extinction was not merely a historical fact, but a necessary truth, a foundational principle upon which the stability of the galactic order rested. Absence, he had maintained, was not a temporary condition, but a terminal state. A species that could not maintain continuous presence in the visible sphere of civilization forfeited its claim to relevance. Yet as the Sol Protectorate systematically reasserted itself across dozens of systems, each reclaimed world a testament to unbroken continuity, Vorn found the pillars of that conviction crumbling beneath the weight of what he could no longer deny. The human reclamation was not a chaotic rush to fill a vacuum, nor a desperate bid to salvage what little remained. It was the methodical restoration of a functioning dominion, executed with the precision of a system resuming operations after a planned hiatus. Entire populations, hundreds of millions, perhaps billions, were transferred from mobile habitats into planetary frameworks rebuilt from archival blueprints. Atmospheric processors, dormant for 10,000 years, were excavated from subsurface vaults, serviced, and brought online, their output measured in the slow thickening of breathable skies. Every action proceeded from a premise of inherent authority, as if the intervening millennia had been an administrative interruption rather than a collapse into oblivion. This relentless competence forced Vorn into a confrontation with the deepest fracture in his own understanding. In the isolation of his private sanctum, surrounded by the archives of his career, the meticulously annotated records of human failure, he replayed intercepted transmissions that defied every analytical model he had ever constructed. Command exchanges between fleet elements were devoid of the improvisation and strain that should have characterized a civilization emerging from millennia of isolation. Officers coordinated the deployment of terraforming arrays and orbital defense grids with the same detached efficiency as a planetary governor managing seasonal resource rotations. They speak as if they have never been absent, Vorn murmured to the empty chamber, reviewing a fragment of dialogue between a returning task force commander and a planetary reclamation director. Primary grid alignment complete. Subsurface vaults unsealed. Population transfer commencing. Standard operational tempo resumed. There was no elation, no awe at the miracle of return, only the quiet assumption that this was the natural order of things, interrupted only briefly by external perception. It was this absence of astonishment that most profoundly undermined Vorn's worldview. He had always believed that survival after total withdrawal demanded desperation, that any remnant capable of reemergence would bear the visible scars of its struggle, fragmentation, improvisation, the ragged edges of a civilization forced to rebuild from scraps. But humanity displayed none of these markers. Their return was not a triumph over extinction. It was the dispassionate resumption of a state that they had never internally conceded as ended. The internal conflict that had shadowed Vorn since the first transmissions now reached its culmination. He had defined human extinction not merely as the cessation of observable activity, but as the irrevocable dissolution of their capacity for meaningful continuity. Yet the evidence forced him to acknowledge a different principle, that a species could preserve the essential substance of its existence, its people, its knowledge, its operational discipline, entirely outside the sphere of external validation. They had not survived as scattered fragments clinging to the edge of annihilation. They had withdrawn as a complete civilization and endured as one, maintaining every necessary capability within self-contained bastions that required no external support. This realization manifested in the Senate as a fundamental shift in the nature of the debate, where once the question had been whether humanity had truly survived. It now became whether the Alliance possessed any legitimate authority to contest their return. The systems they were reclaiming had been empty for 10,000 years, patrolled only by automated beacons and stripped of any permanent habitation. No sovereign claim had ever been successfully established over them. The Alliance had treated them as residual space, a legacy of abandonment rather than a territory held in abeyance. To oppose their reoccupation was to initiate conflict over volumes that humanity had never formally relinquished, and over which no other entity held demonstrable ownership. In a closed session of the Security Council, Vorn found himself articulating a truth he had spent decades denying. "We have operated under the assumption that disappearance equates to forfeiture," he said, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant clarity. "That the absence of visible presence constitutes the transfer of all attendant rights, but the humans have demonstrated that presence is not a prerequisite for continuity. They have maintained the substance of their civilization, its population, its industry, its command structure, independent of external recognition. Their claim never required our acknowledgement to remain valid." Admiral Thaler regarded him with eyes like polished obsidian. "And what does that leave us? They occupy systems we have designated as neutral space, but never inhabited. They assert rights we declared forfeit, but never successfully superseded. To challenge them now is to wage war to enforce an extinction they have plainly refused." The chamber fell silent, the implications settling like dust after structural failure. Every strategic assessment reached the same conclusion. The Alliance lacked both the legal foundation and the tactical advantage to contest the reclamation. The human fleet remained distributed across multiple systems, each element positioned to render the destruction of any single component strategically meaningless. To strike at them would be to fight a war against an adversary that could not be decisively engaged, an enemy that had already proven its capacity to endure total isolation and emerge intact. Vorn stood before the hololith displaying the completed perimeter of the restored Sol Protectorate, a sphere of fully operational systems, their defensive grids active, their populations settled, their infrastructure self-sustaining. For the first time, he understood the true measure of what had returned. It was not a fleet, nor a diaspora, nor a successor state born from the ashes of collapse. It was humanity itself, identical in its essential character to the civilization that had dominated the galaxy 10,000 years before, having preserved every necessary element of its existence through a withdrawal that no other species could have survived. In the solitude of his sanctum, Vorn confronted the final dissolution of his former certainties. He had believed that extinction was an absolute state, imposed by the accumulation of loss and the inevitability of disintegration. But humanity had demonstrated that some forms of existence could not be extinguished by external verdict. They had carried their civilization intact through the void, refusing to allow their identity to be defined by the perceptions of observers. Their survival was not a defiance of the natural order, but a revelation of its deeper structure, that true continuity resides not in visible presence, but in the unbroken preservation of will. As the first open diplomatic channel from Sol Command appeared on Alliance networks, a simple, unadorned request for formal recognition of boundaries that had never been formally dissolved, Vorn understood that the question of humanity's extinction had been answered definitively. It was not a matter of whether they had survived the intervening millennia. It was a matter of whether anything in the universe possessed the power to enforce a termination that they themselves had never accepted. And in that refusal lay a principle more enduring than any empire or archive. Some claims cannot be extinguished by time because their bearers have declined to release them. Here is the eighth part of the story. Part 8. The unyielding claim the restoration of the Sol Protectorate reached a point of operational maturity that rendered further denial not merely futile, but structurally irrelevant. Sensor grids spanning dozens of systems formed a seamless envelope of surveillance and control, their overlapping fields excluding any external intrusion without the need for visible enforcement. Planetary surfaces, once barren relics of collapse, now pulsed with the signatures of active settlement, fusion plants igniting beneath regrowing atmospheres, orbital docks disgorging waves of construction tenders, and the faint infrared blooms of habitats cycling between night and day. The humans had not merely returned, they had reestablished the full measure of their dominion, transforming the silence of 10,000 years into the steady hum of a civilization in motion. Senator Lirak Vorn stood before the Alliance Senate in a session convened not to debate the fact of human survival, but to confront the consequences of its implications. The chamber, once a bastion of confident assertion, now thrummed with the subdued tension of an order compelled to reassess its own foundations. The hololith at the chamber's center displayed the restored protectorate in its entirety, a contiguous domain of fully operational systems, its boundaries defined not by contested frontiers, but by the simple reality of possession. Vorn's voice carried through the vaulted expanse, stripped of the certainty that had once defined his every utterance. For 10,000 years, we have regarded humanity's absence as conclusive evidence of their extinction. We surveyed their worlds, catalogued their ruins, and partitioned their silence among ourselves. We declared their sovereignty forfeit because no visible trace of there will remain to contest it, but visibility is not the measure of existence. The humans have demonstrated that a civilization can withdraw entirely from the sphere of observable events and yet preserve every essential element of its continuity, its people, its knowledge, its capacity for self-determination. He paused, his gaze sweeping the tiers of delegates, many of whom had once regarded his pronouncements as unassailable doctrine. They have not returned as supplicants seeking restitution, nor as conquerors demanding submission. They have simply resumed the exercise of a claim they never formally relinquished. The systems they now occupy were empty, patrolled by our drones, but inhabited by none. No other entity holds title to them, for title cannot be conferred upon a vacuum. The humans have filled that vacuum, and in doing so have revealed the limitation of our central assumption. That absence equates to forfeiture. The chamber absorbed his words in a heavy silence, broken only by the crystalline resonance of Delegate Myron's voice. then what recourse remains to us? If their claim persists undiminished by the passage of time, by what authority do we deny them the space they have reclaimed? Vorn met her gaze without evasion. None. There is no legal mechanism, no diplomatic precedent, no principle of interstellar law that can enforce the extinction of a civilization that has demonstrably refused to accept it. To oppose their restoration is to initiate conflict over territories that we do not occupy, cannot hold against their determined reclamation, and have never possessed in any substantive form. The admission hung in the chamber, a concession that reshaped the contours of the crisis. For the first time, the Senate confronted the full scope of humanity's strategic victory. They had endured without need of external validation, preserving their sovereignty in the unclaimed interstices of space where no other power could challenge them. Their return was not a resurgence from ruin, but the reassertion of a presence that had never been truly extinguished. They had waited not because they were compelled to hide, but because they chose the moment of their reemergence. In the days that followed, the first formal diplomatic exchanges took place, not as negotiations between rivals, but as a mutual clarification of boundaries. Human representatives, appearing via secure quantum channels, articulated their position with unadorned precision. The Sol Protectorate had never ceased to exist. Its core elements had been preserved through deliberate withdrawal, and no external authority had successfully superseded its claim during the period of reduced visibility. They sought no expansion beyond their original domains, made no demands upon Alliance territory, and extended no ultimatums. They simply required formal recognition of a continuity that they asserted had never been interrupted. Vorn observed these exchanges from the periphery, bearing witness to the dissolution of the intellectual framework that had defined his career. He had spent decades proving that humanity's disappearance was absolute, that their absence marked the end of their relevance. Yet the humans had proven that relevance was not a function of unbroken presence, but of unbroken will. They had carried their civilization intact through millennia of isolation, refusing to allow its definition to be dictated by the perceptions of others. Their endurance was not a defiance of entropy, but a mastery of it, the capacity to withdraw without fragmentation, to exist independently of the galactic commons, and to return when the moment of advantage demanded. In the quiet aftermath of these exchanges, Vorn found himself alone in the Senate archives, surrounded by the exhaustive records of the extinction event, the very documents that had formed the bedrock of his certainty. He traced the angular script of ancient human transmissions, their final broadcasts of collapse and withdrawal, and understood at last the nature of their survival. They had not clung to their failing empire in futile desperation, scattering into oblivion. They had executed a controlled disengagement, preserving the substance of their society within hardened, self-sufficient redoubts. The collapse that the galaxy had witnessed was not their annihilation, but their liberation from the constraints of a centralized, vulnerable domain. This was the essence of their strength, the refusal to equate visibility with existence. They had demonstrated that a species could vanish from the stage of events and yet retain the full measure of its identity, waiting not for permission to reclaim its place, but for the moment when its presence could no longer be denied. Their return exposed the fragility of every other civilization's dependence on continuous connection, revealing a form of endurance that required no audience, no validation, no concession from the wider galaxy. As the Alliance moved toward formal recognition of the restored protectorate, acknowledging boundaries that had never been successfully dissolved, Vorn understood the final truth of humanity's persistence. Extinction is not a verdict that can be imposed upon a species that refuses to accept it. A claim cannot be extinguished by time alone when its bearer has preserved the means to enforce it. The humans had not merely survived the void, they had mastered it, transforming absence into a weapon of indomitable continuity. The formal recognition of the Sol Protectorate was not a treaty born of negotiation, nor a capitulation extracted under the shadow of superior force. It was an acknowledgement of a reality that had never ceased to exist, rendered inevitable by the simple, unyielding fact of its persistence. In the cavernous expanse of the Alliance Senate chamber, Senator Lirak Vorn stood before the assembled representatives of 1,000 worlds and spoke the words that marked the end of a 10,000-year presumption. "There is no dispute to be resolved," Vorn said, his voice carrying through the chamber with the weight of a verdict long deferred. "The Sol Protectorate has not been reconstituted from fragments of loss. It has been restored to the state in which it resided prior to its withdrawal. The systems it now occupies were never permanently relinquished, nor were they successfully claimed by any other authority. The absence of visible presence did not constitute the surrender of sovereignty. The humans withdrew, but they did not dissolve. They preserved the full measure of their civilization, its people, its capacity, its unbroken chain of command, and now they have chosen to exercise the rights that were never formally extinguished." The chamber held a silence that was not capitulation, but recognition, the recognition of a truth that no archive, no survey, no declaration of extinction could negate. The hololith at the center of the dais displayed the restored protectorate in its entirety, a domain of dozens of systems, fully operational, its habitats populated, its industries engaged, its defensive architectures seamlessly integrated. This was no emergent polity pieced together from the wreckage of survival. It was a civilization that had carried its essence intact through the intervening millennia, emerging not as a successor state, but as the same entity that had once claimed the heart of the galaxy. The human representatives, appearing through a flawless quantum relay, accepted the formal acknowledgement without ceremony. Their spokesperson, a figure in the stark, utilitarian uniform of Sol Command, delivered a response that required no elaboration. "The Sol Protectorate acknowledges receipt of this recognition. Continuity has been maintained. Operational resumption proceeds as planned. There were no demands, no stipulations, no gestures of reconciliation or recrimination. The humans required nothing beyond the formal cessation of the presumption that their sovereignty had ever lapsed." In the days that followed, the boundaries of the Protectorate stabilized, marked not by demilitarized zones or contested frontiers, but by the tangible reality of possession. Alliance survey operations withdrew without incident. Sensor pickets that had patrolled the empty systems for millennia deactivated under protocols that required no enforcement. The space that had been declared a tomb was filled once more, and the galaxy adjusted to the presence of a power that had never, in truth, departed. For Vorn, the resolution brought not defeat, but a clarity that transcended the framework of his former convictions. He had entered this crisis believing that extinction was an absolute state, a final dissolution that left no capacity for reversal. He had emerged understanding that some forms of existence defy such finality. Humanity had demonstrated that a species could withdraw entirely from the visible order of things and yet retain the full substance of its identity. They had not survived as scattered remnants, clinging to the edge of annihilation. They had endured as a complete and self-sufficient civilization, preserving their will in the unclaimed voids where no external power could compel its surrender. In the quiet of his sanctum, reviewing the final diplomatic exchanges, Vorn contemplated the deeper implication of what had transpired. Every other species in the Alliance measured its continuity through the unbroken threads of presence, networks of trade, communication, and mutual dependence that bound disparate systems into a collective whole. Disrupt those threads, and disintegration inevitably followed. But humanity had severed every such connection, isolating themselves across millennia of deliberate exile, and emerged without fracture. They had redefined survival not as the maintenance of visible dominance, but as the preservation of internal coherence, independent of external validation. This was the measure of their endurance, the capacity to vanish without ceasing to be. They had not asked for permission to return because they had never required it. Their claim rested not on the indulgence of observers, but on the unassailable fact of their continued existence. Time had not eroded their sovereignty because they had refused to allow it to do so. Absence had not constituted forfeiture because they had withheld the essence of their civilization from the processes of forfeiture entirely. As the restored protectorate integrated itself into the broader galactic order, not as a subordinate, nor as an adversary, but as a peer whose domains were accepted as self-evident, Vorn understood the enduring lesson of their return. Extinction is not a verdict that can be imposed upon a species that refuses to accept it as final. A claim cannot be permanently stripped away when its bearer preserves the means to reclaim it. The humans had demonstrated that true sovereignty resides not in the uninterrupted exercise of power, but in the capacity to withhold that power without losing the right to wield it. In the end, the galaxy did not witness the resurrection of a lost civilization. It witnessed the reappearance of one that had never truly departed. The Alliance had declared humanity extinct because they could no longer see them, but seeing is not the measure of existence. The humans had simply chosen when, and under what terms, they would once again allow themselves to be seen. And so, without fanfare, without conquest, without concession, they came home.